electoral interventions. And I want to welcome Dov in this virtual space that right now is actually out of my son's room, actually, and he's probably in some living room. A few words about Dov. I'm posting everything I'm saying in the chat box, but because this is also live streaming, I'm also discussing some of this more technical aspects of his CV here. So basically, Dov and I have met when he was a grad student, but I'm going to give a presentation that is more professional right now. So he's an assistant professor of international relations at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong, and I'm really happy to report that. It's been over 2 years now, or about 2 years now. You're muted. Sorry, you finished your first year?
I'm now studying my third year there. Yeah.
Third year. Okay, so I was right. Yeah. Okay, so 2 years already there. He received his PhD in political science from the University of California and Los Angeles, so UCLA as we call it here. From 2016 to 2018, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University. And then he moved to Hong Kong. I'm not going to try to summarize the book. There are some articles that already have been published, and now finally we got the whole book out. So I'm going to ask Dov to present for about 30 minutes or so, right? Yeah. And then we're going to have a lively discussion. I just want to remind the participants who are gathering that there is a Q&A box and there is a chat box also. I'm not sure whether everybody can see both, but whichever one you see, please type in your question and I will moderate this discussion. Okay, so without further ado, Dov, do you want to share your screen or? Yeah.
Sure, let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, here it is. Okay, does everyone see the slide? Do you see the slides?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So what's name we call it? So good afternoon, everyone, and I thank Harris for this introduction, and thank you for joining the Zoom talk about my book. As was said, it's Meddling in the Ballot Box: The Causes and Effects of Partisan Electoral Interventions. And I'm going to first describe the phenomena that my book studies, and then briefly talk about its frequency and the history, and then give you an idea of some of what my book finds about the causes of such meddling, as well as their effects on election results. And then I will conclude with what I found in this regard about the 2016 U.S. elections. But first, to clearly define what I am exactly talking about, when I'm going to be talking here about partisan electoral interventions, I'm going to be talking about cases in which a foreign power intentionally intervenes in an election in another country prior to the voting, doing various costly measures, either covert or overt, in an attempt to determine who wins in that election. So such interventions include things such as, for example, an open threat by the great power to harm that country if, the quote-unquote wrong person or party is elected, or promises to give it various quote-unquote goodies if the right people, quote-unquote, are elected. It can include also the provision of campaign funding by our intelligence agency or other bodies, or dirty tricks to sabotage the chances of the other side or harm its candidates, like spreading, for example, fake news, quote-unquote, about one of the sides competing in the election. It can also mean things like, for example, pre-election concessions on important issues or the provision of various benefits. It can also include the secret production of campaigning materials for the side that the great power is trying to help, or sending campaign consultants to advise the candidate on campaigning techniques. And basically, for certain acts to be coded as an intervention, there had to be clear evidence that they were being done for this purpose. And basically, such meddling has been around for as long as there has been elections of any kind whatsoever. And the book briefly describes cases going back to the late 18th century and the pre-modern era. Indeed, the American founding fathers themselves were very worried about such meddling. And one major topic in the Constitutional Convention, on which there were quite a few debates, was about what could be done to prevent foreign meddling in US elections. And according to Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 68, one major reason for the creation of the Electoral College was to prevent electoral interventions by foreign powers in US elections. To make a very long story short, which I'd be happy to get to in the Q&A, basically it failed in its job already in the 1790s. And in at least 4 other cases before 2016, there were such interventions by France, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and the UK. Just a moment. In the post-World War II era, the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, began to intervene quite a lot in elections in other countries. And for my research on this book, based on the definition that I gave a minute ago, I constructed the PEIG dataset for partisan electoral interventions by the great powers. A dataset of all American and Soviet Russian or Soviet Russian partisan interventions in national level elections between January 1st, 1946 and December 31st, 2000, using various archival and secondary sources. The first ever dataset of this kind, to my knowledge. And I can talk more about how this dataset was constructed in the Q&A. And I found that during this period, there were 117 such interventions all around the world. As you can see here in this map, or in about 1 in every 9 national level competitive elections during this period. So as you wouldn't be surprised from the map I just showed you, these interventions occurred in 60 different countries, with the most common intervention method, by the way, being the provision of campaign funding. 2/3 of these interventions were covert, and 1/5 occurred in founding elections. 81 of these interventions were done by the United States, and another 36 were done by the Soviet Union or Russia, with Russia's, by the way, favorite area of intervention being usually Europe, while in the case of the United States, its most favorite region was usually Asia. And this is much larger than the number of interstate wars during this period, or for that matter, the much more famous covert coups d'etats as were done, for example, in Iran or in Guatemala. In other words, this book is discussing a policy tool, which is one of the main ways in which great powers used to manage their relations with democracies, or with competitive authoritarian regimes, and with other countries with regimes between these two poles, which in today's world is somewhere around 1/2 to 2/3 of all countries around the world. And most importantly, these type of activities continued after the end of the Cold War. What you are seeing here, for example, on the slide, is from a non-American intervention of this kind, the Russian intervention in the 2004 Ukrainian elections. And what you are seeing here are covertly supplied campaigning materials, 2 samples of campaign posters captured by the quote-unquote orange parties. The poster on the left shows opposition candidate Yushchenko as a supposed devil in disguise. And the one on the right has Bush shown as saying, supposedly, "We are for our Ukraine," which is Yushchenko's party. And here's an example from another post-Cold War electoral intervention. The American intervention in the 1996 Russian election for Yeltsin. And in this intervention, the United States openly pushes the IMF to give Russia a $10.2 billion loan before the Russian presidential election. And this is the second largest ever given by the IMF, despite Russia not being eligible by IMF criteria to any further loans. So it enables Yeltsin to quote-unquote show results to the Russian public. Of this IMF loan, about $1.3 billion arrived before the election. And that enables Yeltsin to also pay salaries to government officials who weren't paid in months, and to use it for various pre-election pork projects, even leaving him some extra time, as you could see on the slide, to dance. So in contrast to what you may have read or saw in some media organs about it, my book finds that there's actually nothing unprecedented or special about the Russian intervention in the 2016 US elections, except for the use of hacking for this purpose, which is basically a digital version of a much older intervention technique. And no as such meddling, as it's sometimes described, some kind of, Cold War artifact, which, like in some kind of bad superheroes movie, was taken out of the cryogenic freeze it was in since 1989 by Putin sometime in 2015. Such meddling was continuing without any interruptions in the whole post-Cold War era, just as that it has been throughout the modern era. However, until very recently, there has been very little research on this topic in political science. In international relations, there's been a lot of recent research about various types of interventions, from covert coups d'etats to intervention in civil war. But before 2016, there were only 2 academic papers on this topic. So when I began working on the research that became this book in the early 2010s, my literature review was very short. From 2016 onward, I and other scholars began studying the effects of such meddling, but with the exception of my research, the question of the effects on election results has not been analyzed in a systematic manner. Likewise, when the causes of such meddling has begun recently to be analyzed, it has been lumped together with other unrelated phenomena like covert coups d'etats, and using theoretical frameworks that better fit those phenomena, but fit very poorly, in my opinion, electoral interventions. Some scholars in comparative politics do sometimes note these interventions, but usually in a tangential manner to other topics that they care about more. So this book is basically a first of its kind in the social sciences. It focuses on such meddling as a separate, standalone phenomena. And by focusing on partisan electoral interventions in this manner, it is able to provide better explanations on why they occur and what effect it has on the election results, as well as a first of its kind empirical analysis of both questions. So as for why electoral interventions occur, I argue that electoral interventions occur when 2 concurrent conditions exist. First, the great power sees a particular domestic actor as severely endangering its interests as to that country. Basically, that's the motive for such an intervention. And second, very importantly, the great power can get cooperation and inside help. Basically, the opportunity for such an intervention. Now, the first condition is pretty commonsensical, so I won't get much into it. But basically, when an important actor in another country has a very different and inflexible preferences than the great power has, then the great power would need massive efforts to get what it wants from it. So under that situation, the great power has an incentive to intervene in an election, because by replacing an unfriendly leader with a friendlier leader, it is easier for it to reach, quote unquote, a good deal on the relevant issues. And because that an electoral intervention is cheaper than, say, a war, or giving massive amounts of foreign aid as, quote unquote, a bribe, it may be a cheaper, more effective option in countries with competitive elections. But usually, this is not a sufficient condition. This is not the only available option for the would-be intervener. And if an electoral intervention isn't feasible, it will choose other, costlier means, except in the very rare cases where it has no other options. And I argue that it's basically usually feasible only if you can get, as the foreign power, another significant political actor in that country to agree to receive such aid from the great power. Why is that? I claim that electoral interventions are basically inside jobs. The would-be intervener needs a local actor to cooperate in such an intervention because an electoral intervention basically means running or helping someone's election campaign. So in order to succeed, the foreign power needs the same kinds of high-quality information that domestic candidates have and use for this purpose. Country-specific electoral data, preferences of important voter groups, what are effective messages, and so forth. And if the great power doesn't have this information, they are likely to fail, or even hurt unintentionally the preferred candidate or party. And because foreign policymakers don't understand other countries' politics, they are unable to connect enough. So if they can't get cooperation, they won't usually do it. Just a moment. However, getting outside help can hurt the domestic actor. If it's covert, the exposure can harm, of course, the assisted side. And in general, such interventions may reduce its electability in the longer term because it can be tagged as a quote-unquote stooge of the foreign power. And its own voters may hate the fact that it's getting help from a foreign power and not vote for it in later elections. So local politicians will agree to such interventions only if they're in a pretty bad political shape, which usually means that they're in one of two conditions. First, they are a fragile victor. In other words, the actor is currently in power, but its political position is very weak, or its electoral viability is quickly declining. And I'm going to talk in a minute about one such case, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in early 1953. Or, second, a blocked or weakening loser. The actor is basically locked out of power either informally or due to declining domestic support, and such as an opposition party in a competitive authoritarian regime. Now, I have in this case some data limitations. It's difficult to collect data on some components, such as, great power threat perception, as to every major domestic actor in every democracy since 1946. So it can't be tested directly through statistical means. Instead, in this book, I use three major methods. First, I code a proxy measure of the willingness of a local actor to receive such aid, in other words, being a fragile victor or a blocked loser, in the dataset of such intervention that I constructed, which I talked about a few minutes ago. A second way is that I examine in depth 6 case studies of elections chosen out of my dataset. Germany 1953, Argentina 1946, Guatemala 1958, Greece 1967, Philippines 1965, Venezuela 1958. And the basic idea is that in each of these cases represents one of the 4 possible combinations of conditions according to my argument. And if I see these factors as important as I would expect, it would support the argument. This is basically the logic of diverse case selection method by Seawright and Gehring, and the way recommended by Plumper and Tuger on how to choose cases from a dataset. Now, in order to enable a Q&A, I will only discuss today the 1953 West Germany case, but I'll be happy to talk about the other 5 cases in the Q&A. So as for the first method, a bit of evidence, looking for a proxy measure from intervention cases in my dataset in which the identity of the aided candidate or party is clear, 76.3% of the receivers of such support in the dataset fit this criteria. In other words, fragile victors or blocked weakening losers. And similar percentages in the American or the Soviet-Russian cases. So the argument here basically about the causes has some applicability as to the overall universe of cases. Likewise, as will be seen later, there is strong statistical support for the argument on the effects, whose logic is derived from this argument on the causes. The third method is through the case studies. And in the case of the 1953 West German election, the main issue in dispute was the EDC, or the European Defense Community, a planned EU-style organization, just one whose focus was on military, not economic integration, and which was supposed to create a common European army. The Eisenhower administration sees the creation of the EDC as very important, helping it as to its main interest that it has as to Germany, by basically, on the one hand, avoiding the creation of a German military, but on the other hand, getting a German military contribution for a European military. It was supposed to solve both the German question and help defend Europe from the Soviets. And eventually, as Eisenhower deeply wanted, it was supposed to also enable the United States eventually to disengage from Western Europe. However, the SPD, or the German Social Democrats, are completely opposed to it. And they basically see the EDC as preventing the reunification of Germany, a cause to which the SPD leadership is deeply attached, both for nationalist as well as personal reasons, as well as protecting it politically from accusations of being insufficiently nationalist. At the same time, the CDU and Konrad Adenauer, the guy you can see there in the background, are in a very bad political situation in early 1953. To give you just a few examples, Adenauer, the German chancellor, has a 34% approval rating. The CDU is badly organized. And Adenauer by then is 77 years old and seen as a temporary placeholder. And it was so basically he had to in 1949 in order to even get the job, he had to persuade his own party member that he's healthy enough by giving them a doctor's note that showed he could do the job for about 2 years. The CDU is non-stop behind the SPD in all polls for nearly 3 straight years. And the CDU is losing one Lander, or midterm in German terms, election after another, getting on average only a quarter of the vote. So Adenauer decides to request American help in the upcoming West German elections. And because of the American fear of the SPD coming to power and killing the EDC, the United States agrees to Adenauer's request. So following Adenauer's request and the American agreement to help him in this election, the United States began to help Adenauer in various costly ways in the run-up to the election, in the ways that Adenauer requested them to. And I'll describe to you here 3 of the ways that the United States intervened in this election. The first example is that the United States agreed to renew a trade agreement with Germany, which gave West Germany major trade benefits. The second example is a food aid program. In June 1953, 3 months before the West German elections, a revolt broke out against the East German regime in East Germany, the June 17th revolt. And this revolt was brutally suppressed by East German and Soviet troops, with hundreds of East Germans being killed. But given, the circumstances of the Cold War, the West German government couldn't do anything to help the East German protesters, despite serious West German public pressures to quote-unquote do something. And that made Adenauer look very, very bad. So the United States gave Adenauer food that the West German government gave out to hungry East Germans at the cost of $15 million to the United States, or about $110 million in today's dollars, giving Adenauer a way to quote-unquote do something and make the West German public happy with him. Finally, 3 days before the elections, following a last-moment request by Adenauer, who seemed to have been worried by the tightening of the polls, the then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, threatened in a press conference, quote-unquote, disastrous effects to Germany if Adenauer is not re-elected. Then Adenauer and the CDU win the elections. The second thing that I check in my book are the effects of such interventions on the intervened election results. And I will talk today about the 3 main hypotheses and findings on this topic. And to clarify, these 3 hypotheses were tested using the same methods used by scholars of comparative politics to study the effects of various factors on election results. So one method was a cross-national large-N statistical analysis. And this analysis used the measure of electoral interventions derived from PEIG and data on 938 national-level executive elections from 1946 to 2000, and applications of economic voting models by major researchers in the economic voting field. And these models include many of the standard cross-national vote share predictors, such as measures of GDP growth, party fractionalization, country wealth, and so forth, and incumbent vote share as the independent variable. The other message for some of these findings, in order to make sure that they reflect what was actually happening at the local level, were pre-election polls from cases of such intervention in which relevant questions on the intervention were asked. And I'd be happy to answer any further questions on methodology and show the regression tables and so forth in the Q&A. And one finding about the effects of such interventions is that they increase the vote share of the aided candidate vote share by 3%, which is a significant substantive or quote-unquote real-life effect. In the United States, for example, such a vote share shift would be large enough to change the identity of the winner in half of all presidential elections that have occurred since 1960. And the basic idea here why this is the case comes from the process in which the great power and the domestic actor agree on an intervention. Basically, great powers won't aid lost causes, and domestic actors won't accept support when they are likely to win, because of the significant potential cost to the client from receiving this aid that I just mentioned. So most interventions will occur in marginal elections when the gap isn't too large. So because more resources that a candidate has usually means higher chances of victory, electoral interventions are likely to have the intended effect. My second main finding is that overt interventions are more effective and increase the vote share of the aided candidate by 3% more than covert interventions do. And I argue that when backlash can occur, covert is better than overt. Why? Because covert removes the risk of an intervention being counterproductive. Otherwise, overt is more effective than covert. Okay, so why is overt usually more effective? Well, because in overt interventions, the intervener can affect voter behavior directly. And basically, because the great power has a lot of resources at its disposal, usually much more than the local politicians, so it can, go above the local politicians' heads and usually outbid them in promising or giving various quote-unquote pre-election goodies, or threaten consequences more severe than any benefits that the other candidates can give. In contrast, in covert interventions, the intervener is just trying to affect the voter behavior indirectly. And there is a limit on how much a foreign power can help in secret without the intervention being exposed. The great power chooses overt only when it knows that the backlash is unlikely from the advice it receives from the client, as occurred in the 1953 West German case that I just described, where, as I noted, Konrad Adenauer basically requested such overt acts from the United States in order to help him in his re-election attempt. So overt interventions are more likely to work. As I noted, the success of electoral interventions depends on local knowledge. In other words, the knowledge of the local actors on how to win elections. And this knowledge, however, comes from their own past political experience. But in founding elections, in other words, the first competitive elections ever in that country, or after, a long period of full authoritarianism, the local actors may have little or no high-quality local knowledge. Why? Because they haven't competed ever in an election or won in the recent past. So as a result, the local actor asks for the wrong types of help from the great power, which does little to help it, or it even backfires. So in those special situations, in other words, founding elections, electoral interventions usually harm the side the great power is trying to help, reducing its vote share by 6.7% on average. I also checked whether incumbents or challengers benefit more from such interventions, but found no effects in disregard. And likewise, I checked whether the size of the intervention matters. And I found very preliminary evidence that interventions that involve the use of many methods of intervention by the intervener are more likely to be successful. Of course, you may ask how these estimated effects applied in real-life intervention cases. So in this table, you can see the estimated election results in 6 intervention cases, both with and without the electoral intervention. Now, I cannot go over each one of these cases in detail due to time constraints, but to give you examples from one case, the fourth one in this table, for example, the 2000 Yugoslav presidential elections, a non-founding election in which the United States aided the challenger, Vojislav Koštunica, in order to remove Slobodan Milošević, the incumbent and president of Yugoslavia, and I estimated the American intervention against Milošević was much more effective. And without this Western intervention against Milošević, his opponent Vojislav Koštunica would have not gained an absolute majority in the first round and would have finished neck and neck with Milošević. In that scenario, Milošević would have probably, with the help of various shenanigans and his control of state resources, won the second round and stayed in power without triggering the mass demonstrations that led to his downfall. Now, naturally, you'd all be interested how these findings apply to the Russian intervention in the 2016 case. And in one of the chapters of my book, I analyzed the 2016 case, both when it comes to the causes and the effects, and basically what happened in 2016 fits my argument. As for the causes, we still have very limited information about why Putin intervened. But the key reason seems to have been his very, very deep fear of Hillary Clinton, whom he saw, as some Russia experts describe, as an existential threat. Why was that? Well, because Putin was afraid that Hillary would start a Cold War with Russia if she became president, such as by expanding American sanctions on Russia due to Putin's invasion of Crimea and selling high-grade weapons to the Ukrainian government. Likewise, we shouldn't let Trump's later victory obscure how bad his political situation was in mid-2016, and how everyone, including probably he himself, was sure that he would lose. He was lagging constantly behind Hillary in the polls for months at end. A 20-to-1 disadvantage in campaign funds in early June 2016. And a large share of the GOP establishment was refusing to unify behind him, with many, for example, being no-shows in the 2016 GOP convention. And while we don't have definite proof yet for collusion, which, given how the tools came out in other electoral intervention cases, will probably take a few decades to come out, there's lots of strong circumstantial evidence from the Mueller report and other sources that someone pretty senior in the Trump campaign probably did collude in some manner with Russia. As for the effects on election results, I found strong evidence from 3 different sources that the Russian intervention played a key role in Trump's electoral college victory in 2016, giving him the winning edge in the 3 swing states that gave him his victory in the electoral college. First, I plugged in the data for the 2016 US elections into the same model that I used to estimate the effects of electoral interventions that I described beforehand. And I found that the Russian intervention increased Trump's vote share by 2.03% and 75 electoral college votes. And you can see on the slide what the electoral college would have looked like in 2016 without the Russian intervention. And without this boost by Putin, Hillary would have won the popular vote by 4.13% and the electoral college 307 to 231. Results pretty similar to what most of us expected in the last days of the campaign. Secondly, I examined pre-election polls which asked questions about the various leaks by WikiLeaks. And these polls, like the one you can see right here on the slide, find that many people who were exposed to these leaks, like in this case, the October 2016 leak of Hillary Clinton's speeches to donors, were significantly less likely to vote for Clinton. And that erased much of the anti-Trump effect of other domestic exposés, such as, the Access Hollywood tape. Thirdly, I examined Google keyword search data at the state level, using a special Google tool used by advertisers called Google Keyword Planner. And I found a big increase nationwide, as well as in the key swing states that gave Trump his electoral college victory, in searches for WikiLeaks and Google after the leaks of the documents stolen by Russia began to come out, increases, as you could see, much larger than the number of votes Trump won in each of these three states. So we have a very strong reason to believe that the Russian electoral intervention in 2016 was the hinge of history that enabled Trump's victory in 2016, just like many other such electoral interventions were in the past. Now, the book also talks about the implication of this research to cybersecurity, but in order to leave time for questions, I will now stop, and I will await your questions.
Thank you so much, Dov. Maybe you can stop sharing, so we can actually see you. We have the first set of questions that has been already addressed to you, but to give you a little bit of time to catch your breath, I will ask you a few questions myself first so that people can start, digesting what you said. And then I will turn to Mike Henning, who is going to be the first one to ask the question. I'll mute them when it's time. So I have a couple of questions, and they kind of came up indirectly through what you were discussing. The first one has to do with, you claim that, but you have some statistics breaking down covert and overt operations, right? And then based on those overall statistics, you suggest that the US was more active than the Soviet Union or Russia on that front, right? But then my question is, while they were possibly more active, is it also possible that the Soviets were better at hiding things that they were doing, right? So is it likely that the Soviets were actually more able to keep covert operations secret than, the US, which had different transparency, maybe standards, or there were actors in society that would push for more knowledge or more transparency on that front. So how would you address that type of a question? And then relatedly, I was wondering to what extent the policies you're describing are substitutes, actually, right, of other policies that were at the same time happening. So obviously, there is no dearth of military interventions or other type of interventions at the same period of time, post-World War II. So is in your opinion, electoral meddling or meddling in the ballot box, to use the title of your book, is it a distinct kind of independent policy, or is it just one policy in the toolkit of great powers? Or when is it more likely to be chosen? Because it's one thing, what your argument is kind of explaining when it would happen, but it's not as clear whether those two variables would also explain why would you prefer that policy rather than something else, right? So those are the two questions I had initially, and then there are more specific questions like Mike Henning's queuing up. So I'll mute myself for better quality, and you can unmute now.
Sure. Thank you very much for these questions, Harris. As for your first question about whether the Soviets were better in hiding things, well, certainly it's, you are right that the KGB has been much more aggressive in policing leaks than the United States has been. But the thing is that one of my main sources of data is a source of data that is not dependent on disability. So basically, one of my key sources is what is known as the Mitronkin archives. In other words, at the end of, there was this guy who was called Vasily Mitronkin, was an archivist to the KGB. And basically, at some time in the 1970s, he began writing summary notes of every document that came through his hands in the KGB archives and keeping them in his house. And, he had 12 long years to do it. And then at the end of the Cold War, he ran off with all of those summaries of his documents to the West and published 2 big fat volumes on this. So basically, when it comes to the Soviet covert interventions, we have basically summaries from their own archive, so to speak. So the ability of the Russians to hide, or the Soviets to hide what they were doing secretly in the Cold War was very limited because that they literally suffered what you could call literally someone was hauling off their archives when they were not noticing. So I believe that while, of course, it's possible that I'm missing a case there and a case here, because, of course, maybe, one morning he was in a bad, didn't feel good and missed that stack of documents and didn't write a summary of them. I think that we have overall, about the same level of knowledge of what the KGB was doing in the Cold War on this front as what the United States was secretly doing in the Cold War on that front. So I would say that overall, given that very major leak, it is very unlikely that there's now, say, 40 or 50 covert Soviet operations hidden in the KGB archive that we don't know about, and that indeed the United States did it much more than the Soviets did, so to speak. Secondly, about to what extent are these interventions substitutes of other policies? So, of course, if such interventions don't work, so to speak, quote unquote, from the point of view of the foreign power, then they, of course, may then try, other policies. So, for example, in the early 1970s in Chile, so to speak, after the United States failed to prevent Salvador Allende from coming to power for intervening in an election, they started, doing more extreme methods that eventually led to the coup d'etat in 1973 that ended his regime in Chile. But I would nevertheless argue that this is a distinct policy because this would be the one most preferred by a foreign power when it comes to a democracy or a semi-democracy, because from its point of view, it's the cheapest option, so to speak. And it's usually the most available. If you have a relatively open elections from the point of view of a foreign power, that is the more cheapest option from its point of view to do it. The order of magnitude you usually need to do in order to, of course, to invade a foreign country, so to speak, or, to organize a covert coup d'etat, which is harder in real life than they describe, in James Bond movies or things like that. Or for that matter, the billions and billions of dollars you would need, to change their mind otherwise, mean that if they can do this, this would be their preferred option, so to speak. So I would say that this would be usually their first go-to tool when they are dealing with this type of regimes, and only afterwards would they consider other policies on the table. So this is a distinct option that is chosen separately from other options on the table under these conditions. But naturally, if it doesn't work, or for some reason the local actors come and say, no way, Jose, or, no way, we're not going to get this assistance. And then, the people they don't want stay in power and continue to cause them trouble, they may then move to other options, so to speak, including those, like covert coup d'etats, military invasions, and things like that.
Thanks so much. So, I guess, Matt, could you unmute Mike Henning if he wants to ask the questions? And if he doesn't, I can there are a few, so maybe you can aggregate them.
No, I'll be happy to, yeah, and I'll summarize. Thank you, and first of all, thank you for hosting this, and thank you for this important work, Professor Levin. It's much needed, and I welcome it. I welcome more and more of it. My background, I'm with USAID, so some of that is coloring my questions, and the main ones are sort of methodological questions. So, for example, you mentioned IMF lending to Russia in '96. You mentioned trade, food aid, statements by senior officials like a Secretary of State, that these are all sort of forms of foreign meddling. But my question then is methodologically, where do you draw the line? Because, of course, multilateral banks, World Bank, IMF, they're doing lending all the time in many countries during election years, during non-election years. Of course, trade agreements are being, discussed and offered at various times. Food aid flows, ideally based on actual need, but I don't discount that there is sometimes potentially a political angle to it. So just wanted to ask you that sort of methodological question about where you draw the line on that being considered a foreign meddling case. And then I'll just quickly ask my second question.
You could come back. I think for the nature of like keeping this as a dialogue, why don't you stay?
Okay. Sure.
Let's temporarily mute you, and then we can go back.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much for these questions and for your comments. I basically draw the line when it comes, to the IMF and multilateral lenders to situations where we have clear evidence that the loan was given for reasons that A, would not fit under the regular criteria, and B, were given for this purpose. Under IMF criteria in 1996, for example, Russia was not eligible to a single dollar from the IMF because they were, laggards in all of their reforms, so to speak. So I would not count, your regular multilateral IMF lending right before the election as an intervention. I would only count it in the special cases where we have clear evidence that it was done for this purpose and that, there was no plausible reason to give it otherwise. Like in the case of Russia, as I said, it was not, there was no plausible reasons to give it otherwise. So most multilateral lending by the IMF and other multilateral lending would not count except for these special conditions where we know that it was done for this specific purpose. As for, trade agreements, food aid, so basically, again, the same thing about food aid and the trade agreements, unless there is clear evidence that this was done for this purpose, we have, documents written by U.S. officials. This leader here is in deep trouble. He really asking from us, $50 million in food aid in order to give out that, rice before the election to the voters. Let's give him that thing. We want to help him. We want him to win. Then, in that case, I would count it. But, most food aid or other U.S. aid, which is not related to that, and I want to make it clear, most U.S. aid is not, designed, for this purpose. And of course, not most, American trade agreements are meant, to make someone win an election. But so basically, except for that situation, most of this type of stuff is not counted. It is only counted when it is done explicitly for this purpose in the run-up to a particular election. We have, clear proof that it was done for this purpose. So, if there's, say, a 5-year agreement to give aid every year to that country by, say, $20 million, and it was decided, say, in 1965, and then there's an election in 1970, and that's part of a decision made in 1965, and that's, part of that regular aid distribution, that doesn't count as an intervention, so to speak. Only an act done for this purpose in the election year for this purpose. So that is my answer to your first two questions in this regard.
So, Mike, do you want to follow up or?
Sure. No, thank you. That's an excellent answer. Thank you. And I buy it. The line can be a little gray, but you have to try to draw it. I welcome that. And then my other comment, really, and I just want to emphasize this, is that you base a lot of your argument on the idea that you can identify an intervention and then how that would change vote share. So you've estimated vote share prior to election and then come up and compared it to actual outcome of the vote share after the election. Again, pre-election is great to do. You can do polling in some cases. I don't know if that exists from before, but it'd be interesting to understand how you were able to estimate vote shares. And I know you have some methodology there. I look forward to maybe learning it and reading it. But again, if you're able, and this is the part too, is the causality of that intervention. So, okay, you estimate the vote share before and post. And if you can identify that it's that foreign meddling that really made that turn, because there's so many, of course, intervening variables when voters vote. They have so many things that they think about before they pull that ballot test question. And if you're able to truly, identify that that the effects of intervention to this level of precision, you really have hit on something major, because that is, of course, the whole business of politics, is trying to advise campaigns and politicians how to do what and what that will lead to for their vote. So again, I look forward to you discussing maybe how you're able to distill that into the best of the data that you have. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for this question. Just to make it clear, I'm not in any way endorsing the use of this method. In other research, I find it has a lot of very negative effects. So if this would be a cigarette, it would have a sign, do not use, it's bad for your target's cells. As for, the polling, as for, the message, so for example, I also use, as I noted, pre-election polling for some cases where, there were pre-election polls that asked relevant questions in this regard. And I find that when there are questions that ask about some of the key message, when it's done in public, we many times see that factor increases the vote share of the preferred side. And these type of polls are some of the polls done for this purpose when, people in American politics or comparative politics come afterwards and say, okay, why did, say, Bush win in 2004 against John Kerry? So basically, I'm using the same types of surveys with the same type of question that they would use in order to make those analyses. Now, as for causality, I agree, of course, that, there's many factors that determine why people vote. And actually, just to make it clear, of course, I'm not claiming that, if some country intervenes in a certain election, that is the only factor why that side won. And of course, as you could see from the size of the effect, this is not enough on its own, to save a candidate in deep political trouble. The candidate has to help themselves. They have to already make sure, that other stuff are going their way, at least in a minimal way, so this could help them, so to speak. I nevertheless would argue that there's a good reason to believe that this is actually having an effect, because I'm using the same exact message used by people in American and comparative politics in order to analyze, these election results. I, for example, used, in order to analyze the effect of electoral interventions, the same type of voting models across multiple countries that were used in papers in comparative political studies and the APSR, done by, pretty major names in this field, so to speak. So no, these are the factors, but these are the type of models by which they estimate, for example, why if for example, the economic vote matters, and if so, how much, so to speak. So naturally, while I cannot have 100% certainty in this regard, I would say that given that I'm using the same message people in comparative politics use in order to estimate, what factor mattered more and what factor mattered less, this is, I believe, as good as we can have as to the effects of it. And that basically this is using the same message that, we use in order to estimate, the effects of, say, the economic vote or of other factors. So while there isn't, I agree that we cannot have 100% certainty, we have a very good reason, given how we analyze the effects of other factors, that this has also an effect as well in many cases.
Okay. We have quite a few participants, but I haven't received any burning questions. But maybe if I invite them to ask questions, they will. It's kind of difficult to put pressure on the audience when you don't see them. So I see now a new comment, but it's again from Mike Henning. So let me relay that. He thanks you for the answers, and he works at USAID, I think. So I guess all of these are really pertinent questions there. So in the absence of other questions, I will jump in. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the Greek case, because I haven't read that part of the book yet, but I'm wondering how you see the 1967 situation, given my expertise in a way. But since there is no other question, I'll take advantage of that and ask you to give me your take on this.
Yeah, so the 1967 Greek election case is one of the cases in which the United States was seriously considering, but eventually decided not to intervene. And the reason why it was thinking about intervening was because of Andreas Papandreou, the guy which I believe you did a very nice, good movie on. By the way, I really liked it. What's the name you call it? And basically, the United States was becoming...
Searching for Andreas, yeah.
Yeah, so basically, the United States was getting worried in the mid-1960s about him because Andreas Papandreou in that period, as a way to, prepare himself for replacing his father, George Papandreou, when he would retire, was beginning to take various foreign policy stands, which were considered in that time's political era as semi-neutralist, so to speak. So that alarmed a lot of people in the U.S. Embassy and in the Greek desk in the State Department. It was saying, oh my God, his father is really old. It is very likely that if George Papandreou wins another power again, Andreas will replace him, a year or two after he wins power. And then we would have this guy who they perceived as being, this guy who was a really neutralist tendencies who will lead Greece to leave NATO, which remember, in the 1960s, France was leaving. So the fear that NATO would collapse was pretty serious at the time, so to speak. And, if there would be a domino effect. And they were also worried, of course, that Greece, which was a major key part of NATO, would leave NATO and weaken American a role in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was pretty important in that era, so to speak.
So wait, all of these were discussions you found about the possible, there were planned elections that never happened, obviously, because there was a coup d'etat. But so what you found was basically archival. I'm trying to explain also, there's some graduate students on our call. So basically you identified archival materials that describe these motivations, right? And you coded those, you coded everything based on those, I suppose, right?
Yeah. So it was based on, archival documents that I found, in, for example, the Presidential Library of LBJ in Austin, Texas, in the U.S. National Archives in right next door to you. What's the name you call it? Which they have a lot of documents now declassified about that.
The National Security Archive, we call it. Yeah, the Gilman Library, you mean?
Not just them, but also the National Archives in College Park, Maryland.
Oh, yeah. That's the bigger one. No, I thought you meant next to GW, which is inside GW, yeah.
Yeah, no, they were also very useful in other cases. And basically, so they were worried about it. So they were thinking about doing it, but they had so some people in the U.S. government were thinking about it, but they had two problems. One problem is that no one inside Greece itself, any of the Greek conservatives was not interested in such, American interference in their elections. We know that they basically, turned to some of them and said, would you be interested in American intervention to help against this guy? And they said, no, we have other methods, forget about it. And, and likewise, inside the U.S. government itself, more senior personnel, like, the then U.S. National Security Advisor, the then Secretary of State, and other people thought that, these fears of the U.S. Embassy and the local CIA station and the Greek desk in the State Department were exaggerated. That, that if Andreas Papandreou would come to power, he would be a bit annoying, but they could live with him. So as a result, in two really long discussions of the 303 committee, which was the one that was deciding in the U.S. government whether to intervene in elections or any other covert operations of the CIA, they reached the conclusion that first, he's not much of a threat, and secondly, more importantly, no one's really interested in it in Greece, so they don't have a really good chance of it working, so to speak. So as a result, the then Secretary of State basically and other members of the 303 committee decided to reject that proposal of intervening and decided not to intervene in this way when they made that decision 3 months before the elections, when they assumed that the election would go forth and occur, so to speak. So that's very briefly the story.
So again, the reason I'm asking about the Greek case, it's also a way that I can push you more in your logic, right? Because we do know at the same time that from other sources that there were preparations for a potential coup d'etat by generals again, orchestrated to an extent, or at least assisted by the CIA. So again, that brings back my original question about, are these substitute policies, or is there a sequential logic where we try the less costly one, and then we go with the most costly, you indicated that, but in this case, how do you think it played out? Well, obviously we didn't have the election, but you said they had already given up on that as a possibility, right?
Yeah, it seems, at least from what I know, that the United States was not interested in that coup. That, when that coup happened, eventually, it was the colonel's coup, it wasn't the general's coup, that the United States was caught by surprise and seemed to have not expected it. They heard, they had these rumors about the general coup, but it seems that at least most of the senior U.S. government officials were not interested in aiding it, so to speak. So it seemed that this policy was conducted separately than at least in the Greek case, was conducted separately than any plans for a coup d'etat, things like that. The United States, from my knowledge, wasn't preparing either, so to speak. So in this case, there was no plans for it, and they weren't planning to intervene. Naturally, in an alternate universe in which there was the 1967 Greek elections, in which, Andreas Papandreou eventually became a prime minister already in the late 60s, and then took on a very tried to implement in practice his policies he was talking about. Who knows, so to speak? Maybe they would have tried a more expensive option of that kind.
That makes sense. So I'm sure, we need a whole book to adjudicate a lot of this, obviously, if not more. But it's good to get a sense of your thought process. I was also interested, and I think a lot of the people who are connected in the call and also will watch this later, they will be probably really interested in the upcoming election in the United States. And you already covered you gave us your view of what happened in 2016, suggesting both what the incentive structure was and how your argument applies. Or the obvious question is, although we're not prophets in political science, like we're close enough to the election that you should have predictions based on your theory. I'm sure you're probably thinking of writing an opinion piece on this. That's one question that I'm pretty sure you expected. The second question, corollary to this, is to what extent do you think there is, once somebody has read your book, and that's kind of like the beauty of social science, and the problem of social science is that whenever we're right and we get something right, then in theory, if people read our books, they can then anticipate all this and overcome it, right? So in theory, if let's say a particular group of people in the US read it, that they should read it, how could they avert this meddling or potential meddling having an effect, right? That's kind of, generally speaking, that would be a question I could ask you for any case. But given that we're based in the United States, you could tell us how you think this applies and how it could be averted, assuming that every democracy wants foreign meddling not to happen, right?
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions. As for the 2020 election, we seem to have some evidence of a Russian intervention for Trump. Naturally, there's now 44 days left, so we don't know what is being planned in the next 44 days by Russia, so to speak. So we don't know yet. So far, it seems from the available evidence to be at a lower key and using the methods of, the Facebook pages and the fake news, but not, the methods of leaking and hacking that they used as well in 2016. So I believe that, my belief is that in 2016, the bigger effect was of the hacking and leaking of documents, unless, the Facebook pages and fake news and things like that, so to speak. So naturally, it's too early to tell what they are planning there in the Kremlin in this regard. But if what they are planning to do is what they seem to be doing, again, we only have some preliminary evidence for it so far, I don't expect it to be large enough to determine the election, so to speak. So maybe they have stuff which are bigger, but I don't think, especially given that everyone's in a high alert over this business since 2016, and people are more aware of the possible, manipulation involved, I think it's going to be much harder for the fake news to work as it did in 2016. And I don't think that was anyway the major factor that determined. It was, I believe, as I said, the leaks and the hacks and, the hacks of those stuff. So my prediction is that we have to be, of course, be very careful, do everything possible to, stop it. But I do not, but naturally, although we cannot predict anything in advance with 100% certainty, I don't expect this one to be, the factor that determines, who wins, so to speak. As for how to stop such meddling, well, at the moment, there is no way to prevent it in 100%. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, a lot of people who are much smarter than I am in institutional design have been literally thinking about, how to prevent foreign meddling all of the way back in 18th century. And all of their ideas for this purpose do not, given what we know today with a much better record than we have of such meddling than they have, would not probably work. As I said, the Electoral College, for example, did not, do the job of stopping such meddling as they were hoping even in the 1790s. Nevertheless, I think there are some ways in which you can reduce the chances that it will work, so to speak. So, in other words, you cannot stop it from happening, but you could, you could call it, harm reduction, so to speak. Reduce the chance that it will cause, the result that the intervener wants it to cause. So I would argue that, for example, one thing that can be done, of course, not in the next 44 days, but, in the future when there's time for it, would be first, have a law in which collusion or cooperation with a foreign power for this purpose is an act, which is, a separate criminal act, which, as we discovered from the Mueller report, it is not at the moment, and that it would carry a very heavy sentence. I would recommend, similar sentences to, spying. And the basic idea would be here that in that case, it would not, stop the politicians from cooperating with a foreign power, because, as I said, they are usually very desperate that they are willing to do such a thing, and they can hope, after the election, we will tell the FBI, don't investigate it. But you can't prevent other third actors, which are private citizens who may be needed for the cooperation. Say a newspaper editor who is being contacted by some foreign agent and said, here are some convenient documents to publish. Let me give you some extra money to publish those documents a week before the election, which is, as happened in the 1940 American election when the Nazis intervened. If you could, for example, make the punishment high enough, it could at least deter private actors in the target, which are not connected to one of the politicians, from being involved in it. They will say, I'm not willing for $100,000, for example, to take the risk of being for life in jail, so to speak. So that can help deter at least some domestic actors from getting involved in it, making it harder to conduct. The second thing I would argue is basically that you need to, for this purpose, you need to also have a PSA campaign about foreign meddling to basically convince people that, say no to foreign meddling. Anyone who thinks that it's still a good idea, to convince them not to do it, that it's not. And the basic idea would be that would discourage, that would help people believe that such meddling is a very bad idea. So in the future, if they hear that, someone is doing it, it would be the type of, I am not going to vote for you ever because you now are getting aid from a foreign power, so to speak. And that would deter an overt intervention, which, as I said, depends on, the public not having a backlash and is also more effective. So if you would have a PSA campaign that would be persuasive to people, don't vote, persuade people that any foreign interference, even for your side, is a bad thing, that is a deal breaker with your own candidate, so to speak, then that may lead, future interveners to do the less effective covert message, so to speak. What's the name you call it? And likewise, I would also recommend to prevent any possible attempts by foreign powers to, in the future to break into electronic voting machines and try to change the results, to have all voting done on paper and counted on paper, so to speak. So that would be a way to prevent, any future attempt by a foreign power to try to, take over some voting machines and change the results, because paper cannot be hacked, basically. So if you put it in paper, we can be pretty sure that such a thing will not be done in the future. So as a very brief summary, those would be some of my major recommendations on how we can, do harm mitigation as to such meddling.
I see. And I suppose there is a discussion like that in the book. In the policy implications part. Yeah. So this is obviously very important discussions, and I'm sure there are some people who are thinking about all this. In the case of the US, I was thinking while you were talking, or any other case where meddling has already been, has either definitely happened or people at least think it has happened definitely. I think there is an added kind of immunization or of the population by having been exposed to that. Maybe they're more alert, or maybe they're more less likely to fall for it the second time around, right? So I'm saying, so it sounds like while you're finding that it doesn't work well in founding elections, it does sound like that it does work probably better once, but it's probably not very effective as a policy of a great power if it's repeated, right? Because I don't know if you have any findings of that sort. Like, is repeated? First of all, we don't know. I don't know your data, so I don't know how many repeated consecutive elections we found such meddling, and to what extent, if we don't find that effect, it could be not because it wasn't tried, but because the population had already kind of discounted or taken into account some of this.
Well, some of these cases are repeat interventions, and I was indeed wondering, are we seeing, reduced effects or increased effects when it's, the second or third or fourth time, so to speak? And I don't see any reduction in these effects. And I think one reason is that many times when it's a repeated one, each time they do something different, so to speak.
I see. Okay. Yeah, the methods change. Yeah.
So there's multiple methods they can use, and each time different stuff works better and from their point of view.
I see. Okay, so that's a great answer. I mean, I apologize. I haven't seen the statistics or the data set. So, but I'm eager to take a look at it. So if we don't have any more questions, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I wish you, I wish the book all the best, and you in particular. And I hope, many people read it. It's now, available from your online vendors, I guess, and in libraries soon, I suppose. Dov, do you want to close with any, particular statement or any wish for the future? I don't know.
Well, I can just say that these are common and important phenomena, and we are likely to see a lot of them in the future. And unfortunately, I do not expect such meddling to stop anytime in the future, given that there's a lot of potential opportunities. In other words, elections all around the world. And there's a lot of domestic actors which are unscrupulous enough to be willing to cooperate in that manner, so to speak. So, unfortunately, this stuff
not a very optimistic note, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's unfortunately going to continue, but there are ways to reduce the harm from such meddling in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you did unpack those, and I thank you for this. So I'm going to virtually ask all the participants to join me in thanking you, and wish you all the best. Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation.
Bye-bye. Yeah.